the call that shook the foundations of Europe. To truly understand the phenomenon we call the Crusades, we must take a journey back in time to the autumn of the year 1095. Western Europe at that time was not the static world plunged into absolute ignorance that popular myths often paint about the Middle Ages. On the contrary, the continent was undergoing a phase of intense turmoil. The population was growing at a rapid pace thanks to improvements in agricultural techniques, such as the use of the iron plow and crop rotation. Villages were expanding, trade was experiencing a modest rebirth, and the Roman Catholic Church stood as the most powerful, influential, and centralized institution in the Western world, exercising almost absolute control over the collective mindset, morality, and political structures of the era. However, behind this facade of growth and religious fervor, Western Europe was suffering from a severe and chronic internal disease, endemic violence. The collapse of the Carolingian Empire centuries earlier had fragmented power, giving rise to the feudal system. In this system, each lord controlled his own territory through military force. This generated a massive class of professional knights, men trained from childhood in the art of war, whose sole social function was to fight. In the absence of external enemies or a strong central government to enforce the law, these feudal knights spent their time warring against each other for small strips of land, plundering defenseless peasant villages, attacking merchants on the roads, and spreading terror across the continent. The Church itself tried to contain this bloodshed with decrees like the Peace of God and the Truce of God, which prohibited combat on certain days of the week or against civilians, but such measures have limited effect. It is precisely against this backdrop of social tension that Pope Urban II foresaw a masterful opportunity. In November 1095, he called a council in the French city of Clermont. On the final day of the event, the number of nobles, clergymen, and commoners who attended was so monumental that no church could hold the crowd. The pontiff had to deliver his speech from a makeshift platform in the middle of an open field. Urban II delivered one of the most dramatic, calculated, and incendiary speeches in recorded human history. He did not limit himself to talking about theology or the salvation of the soul. He painted a terrifying and violent portrait of the situation in the Middle East. The Pope claimed that Eastern Christians and pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land were being brutally murdered, tortured, and enslaved by a new emerging power, the Seljuk Turks, who had seized control of Jerusalem. Urban II described profane altars and holy sites turned into stables. The Pope then directed his gaze directly at the proud and violent European nobility watching him. He issued a challenge that would alter the course of history. You, knights who spread terror and fight against your own brothers out of vanity, look to the east. Direct your swords toward a war that is truly just and holy. Cease being predators in Europe to become soldiers of Christ. To seal the pact, Urban II made an extraordinary and unprecedented promise in Catholic theology up to that point, the plenary indulgence. Any man who marched toward Jerusalem moved by faith and the desire to liberate the Holy Sepulchre would have all his sins immediately forgiven. If he died on the journey, his entry into paradise was guaranteed. The psychological impact of those words on a society deeply obsessed with the fear of hell and eternal damnation was overwhelming. The crowd was seized by a collective trance. A deafening and unanimous cry echoed through the valleys of Clermont, Deus Vult. Deus Vult. God wills it. Men of all social classes began to weep, fall to their knees, and cut pieces of red cloth to sew them onto their chests and shoulders in the shape of a cross. The term crusade did not yet exist. They called themselves armed pilgrims or those who took the cross. The era of the Crusades was officially inaugurated, a military, religious, and mass migration movement that would last nearly 200 years and whose echoes would shape global geopolitics to this very day. The deep causes: demographic pressure and commercial ambition. To make a complete and honest documentary, we cannot reduce the Crusades to a mere outbreak of religious fanaticism. Faith was undoubtedly the emotional trigger and the fuel that kept the movement alive, but the hidden gears that moved thousands of men across continents were deeply social, socio-economic, and geopolitical. The first major structural factor was the land crisis affecting the European nobility, intimately linked to the law of primogeniture. As the population of nobles grew, land within the fiefs became scarce. To prevent large estates from being fragmented and losing political power, feudal tradition dictated that only the eldest son would inherit all of the father's property, including the castle, arable lands, and serfs. The second, third, and fourth sons, known as the cadets of the nobility, received only military training, a suit of armor, and a sword. They were born noble but were dispossessed of assets. They could not cultivate the land because that was seen as a dishonor to their caste, and they had no fiefs to rule. This immense mass of young, highly trained, and status-hungry nobles turned Europe into a powder keg. When the Pope pointed toward the east, these disinherited knights saw the chance of a lifetime. The Middle East was described in accounts of the time as a mystical land where milk and honey flowed. For these men, crossing the sea was not just an act of devotion, but the only real opportunity to conquer land, found their own principalities, obtain titles of nobility, and achieve the wealth that the European continent systematically denied them. Parallel to this, in southern Europe, the economic dynamics of the Mediterranean Sea were driving a silent but powerful transformation. Italian city-states with a strong maritime vocation, especially Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, were experiencing an impressive commercial rise. Their elites were composed of pragmatic and astute merchants. However, Italian commercial expansion ran into an invisible wall, the absolute control that the fleets of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates exercised over the most lucrative sea lanes and strategic ports of the Middle East. These routes connected Europe to the silk and spice routes coming from deep Asia. For Italian bankers and shipowners, the Crusades were not just a holy mission, they were the largest and most promising commercial venture of the century. They realized that by financing ship construction, transporting Crusader armies, and providing supply lines and food for the military campaigns, they could demand exclusive commercial rights in return. The plan was clear. If Christian armies could capture strategic port cities in the Levant, such as Acre, Tyre, and Antioch, the merchants of Venice and Genoa could establish factories, warehouses, and direct routes, breaking centuries-old Islamic trade monopolies and enriching their republics in an unprecedented way. The Crusades, therefore, were also born out of an aggressive strategy of mercantile expansion. Finally, there is the component of international geopolitics involving the Eastern Roman Empire, widely known as the Byzantine Empire. With its capital in the monumental, wealthy, and fortified city of Constantinople, the Byzantines were the direct heirs of Greco-Roman culture and had functioned for centuries as a protective shield for Christian Europe against Eastern invasions. However, in the 11th century, the Byzantines began to suffer humiliating military defeats at the hands of a new military power, the Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people from Central Asia who had converted to Islam and adopted an extremely aggressive military posture. The Byzantine crisis reached its catastrophic peak in the year 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert. In this clash, the Turkish armies not only crushed the imperial forces but also captured the Byzantine emperor himself, Romanos IV Diogenes. Following this defeat, the Turks advanced rapidly across the Anatolian Peninsula, modern-day Turkey, seizing vital agricultural territories for Byzantium and drawing dangerously close to Constantinople. Faced with the imminent risk of the total collapse of his empire, the new Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, made a desperate decision. He swallowed his pride and sent ambassadors to the west to beg for military aid from Pope Urban II. Alexios had a purely pragmatic and limited vision. He only wanted the Pope to use his influence to recruit a few thousand well-trained Western mercenary knights. These men would be placed under the command of Byzantine generals to help push the Turkish borders back. The Byzantine emperor could never have imagined that his desperate appeal would light an uncontrollable fire in the west, and that instead of a disciplined army of mercenaries, he would see an uncontrollable human tide of hundreds of thousands of Westerners marching toward his borders, bringing with them their own political ambitions and religious distrust. The People's Crusade, the tragic trail of blind faith. The overwhelming enthusiasm sparked by Urban II's words spread so quickly and uncontrollably that it immediately broke through the barriers of military planning and the Catholic Church's own authority. The Pope had planned an aristocratic, coordinated expedition composed exclusively of professional warriors who would depart only in the summer of 1096, after the harvest, ensuring supplies. But apocalyptic fervor took hold of the poorest layers of the population before the nobles could even put on their armor. In early 1096, an austere-looking man wearing rustic clothes and riding a donkey began to travel the roads of northern France and Germany. He was known as Peter the Hermit. Endowed with a magnetic and charismatic oratory, Peter preached to the illiterate and oppressed masses of medieval villages. He claimed to have received a letter from Jesus Christ himself commanding the liberation of Jerusalem and guaranteed that true faith would be enough to topple the walls of the infidels, without the need for weapons or training. The result was an explosion of collective hysteria. A gigantic and chaotic crowd of more than 40,000 people, composed of destitute peasants, shoemakers, blacksmiths, women, the elderly, and children, abandoned their homes, sold their few agricultural tools for derisory prices, and joined Peter the Hermit. This movement went down in history as the People's Crusade or the Crusade of the Poor. They marched without maps, without professional military leadership, and without any kind of logistics for food. Many peasants were so ignorant of world geography that upon spotting the towers of any large European city on the horizon, they innocently asked if that was already Jerusalem. The trail of this People's Crusade was marked by horror, blood, and tragedy long before they ever reached Islamic territory. As this hungry human mass advanced through Eastern Europe, supplies ran out quickly. To avoid starving to death, the popular crusaders began plundering villages, barns, and Christian cities along the way. This generated violent armed clashes against the local populations of Hungary and the Balkans, who retaliated by killing thousands of peasants. Even more terrible was the surge of anti-Semitism that religious fanaticism fueled in Central Europe. Led by even more radical figures, such as the Knight Count Emicho of Leiningen, many popular crusaders began to question why they should march thousands of kilometers to fight God's enemies in the east if the killers of Christ, the Jews, lived peacefully in their own European cities. This distorted reasoning unleashed the first major systematic pogroms in medieval European history. Entire Jewish communities in prosperous cities along the Rhine River, such as Worms, Mainz, Speyer, and Cologne, were brutally attacked. The popular crusaders invaded synagogues and residences, offering Jews the choice between forced baptism or death. Thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were massacred, and their wealth was confiscated by the crusaders to finance the journey. The leadership of the Catholic Church condemned the massacres, and local bishops tried to protect Jewish communities in their palaces, but the enraged crowds ignored the orders and broke through the defenses. 38. In the summer of 1096, the exhausted and disfigured remnants of the People's Crusade finally reached the imposing walls of Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I was horrified as he looked out at that multitude of hungry, ragged, and undisciplined people. Fearing that they would begin plundering his magnificent capital and realizing they stood absolutely no chance in a real battle, Alexios acted fast. He provided ships and dispatched the entire crowd across the Bosporus Strait, leaving them in Turkish territory in Anatolia. The outcome was swift and cruel. Ignoring the advice of Peter the Hermit, who begged them to wait for the arrival of the European nobles, a vanguard of peasants advanced toward the city of Nicaea. The Turkish Sultan Kilij Arslan I set a perfect trap. In October 1096, at the Battle of Civitate, Turkish archers and cavalry ambushed the crowd in a narrow valley. Lacking armor, shields, and military formation, the popular crusaders were completely annihilated within a matter of hours. Men, women, and the elderly were slaughtered without mercy. The few thousands who survived were captured and sold as slaves in the markets of the East. The People's Crusade ended there, leaving a colossal mountain of sun-bleached bones in Anatolia, a tragic testament to the danger of blind faith devoid of reason and planning. The Crusade of the Nobles, the military might of the West. While the tragedy of the People's Crusade was playing out, the official armies of the so-called Crusade of the Nobles, or the First Crusade proper, were finishing their complex and careful preparations. This was a force of a completely different nature. It was a formidable war machine, composed of the military elite of Western Europe, heavy armored knights, disciplined infantry, archers, and military engineers. No European king participated in this expedition. Many were in political conflict with the Pope, but it was led by some of the most powerful men and brilliant strategists of the high feudal nobility. Prominent among them was Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, a man of imposing stature, deeply religious, and respected for his integrity, his brother, Baldwin of Boulogne, ambitious and calculating. Bohemond of Taranto, a formidable Norman warrior from southern Italy, a master of guerrilla tactics and military psychology, and the elderly and immensely wealthy Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, who led the largest contingent of troops from southern France. Divided into 4 large armies that took different routes by land and sea to avoid completely exhausting the resources of the regions they passed through, the nobles managed to move around 100,000 people, including 10,000 elite mounted knights. In late 1096 and early 1097, these forces began to converge on Constantinople. The arrival of the Western nobles triggered an intense diplomatic and cultural crisis with the Byzantine court. Emperor Alexios I, who expected only a small group of mercenaries under his command, found himself facing gigantic armies led by proud and independent men. The distrust was mutual. The Byzantines saw the Westerners as rude, violent, and heretical barbarians. The Crusaders saw the Byzantines as effeminates, treacherous, and excessively focused on political intrigue. With a brilliant mix of bribery, luxurious banquets, and military pressure, Emperor Alexios managed to control the situation. He demanded that each of the great Crusader leaders swear a formal oath of vassalage to him. Under this oath, the European nobles committed to returning to the Byzantine Empire all cities and territories they conquered from the Turks along the way to Jerusalem. Reluctantly, the Crusader leaders signed the document. In the spring of 1097, transported by Byzantine vessels, the Crusader forces crossed the Bosporus and stepped onto Anatolian soil. The real war was about to begin. The ordeal of Anatolia and the long siege of Antioch. The military campaign in Anatolia was a brutal reality check for the European knights. Accustomed to short feudal wars in Western Europe, where battles took place in green, temperate fields, they found themselves marching under the scorching sun of arid deserts and rocky mountains. Logistics became a living nightmare. The Seljuk Turks utilized a military tactic unknown and highly effective against the Europeans. The light cavalry of horse archers. The Turks did not engage in direct hand-to-hand combat. They rode swiftly around the heavy Crusader armies, unleashing clouds of deadly arrows from long-range composite bows and retreating immediately before the knights could launch a lance charge. The first major test occurred at the Battle of Dorylaeum in July 1097. The Crusader army, split into 2 columns, was ambushed by the forces of Sultan Kilij Arslan. The column led by Bohemond of Taranto was surrounded by thousands of Turkish horse archers. Under suffocating heat and without water, the European knights formed a compact shield wall to protect the civilians and infantry. Their chainmail armor withstood most of the arrows, but their horses were slaughtered by the thousands. When defeat seemed imminent after hours of desperate resistance, the Second Crusader column, led by Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse, unexpectedly appeared over the hills behind the Turks. With battle cries echoing and lances lowered, the heavy Crusader cavalry crushed the Turkish lines in a devastating charge. The Turks, shocked by the shock value of the Western knights, fled in panic, abandoning their camp filled with treasures and provisions. Dorylaeum proved to the Muslims that the Crusaders were formidable adversaries. The victory cleared the way through Anatolia, but the human cost was colossal. In the crossing of the subsequent deserts, thousands of Crusaders died of extreme dehydration, heatstroke, and dysentery caused by consuming contaminated water. Valuable warhorses collapsed and died due to the lack of pasture, forcing proud knights to carry their heavy iron armor on their backs under the blazing sun, or to mount camels, oxen, and donkeys confiscated from local peasants. In October 1097, the survivors of the journey finally reached the gates of Antioch, one of the most important, wealthy, and fortified cities in the entire Middle East. Antioch was a monumental strategic obstacle. Its immense walls, built in Roman times, stretched for kilometers, scaling the slopes of rocky mountains, defended by hundreds of towers and garrisoned by a well-supplied and determined Muslim garrison. The Crusaders knew they could not advance toward Jerusalem leaving a fortress of that size intact in their rear. Thus began the legendary and terrible siege of Antioch, which would last 8 long and dramatic months. The winter of 1097 turned the Crusader camp outside the walls into a literal hell on earth. Torrential rains turned the ground into deep mud, destroying tents. The food supply ran out completely, triggering widespread starvation of apocalyptic proportions. Chroniclers who witnessed the siege report that soldiers ate grass, roots, the leather of their own shoes and shields, and even the decaying bodies of dead horses and camels. There are documented accounts of cannibalism, where desperate crusaders dug up the bodies of dead enemies to roast their flesh over makeshift campfires. Diseases such as typhus and scurvy decimated hundreds of men every day. Despondency was so deep that panic gripped the camp. Hundreds of soldiers and knights deserted and fled toward the coast to try to catch ships back to Europe. Even Peter the Hermit, who had survived the massacre of his popular crusade, tried to flee in the dead of night but was captured by other knights and brought back under public humiliation. The salvation of the Crusaders came not through the force of arms, but through the treachery and political cunning of Bohemond of Taranto. The Norman leader managed to establish secret contact with an Armenian guard named Pyrrhus, who was the commander of one of the main towers of Antioch's wall and held a deep grudge against the city's Muslim governor. Pyrrhus accepted a bribe and promised to open the defenses. On the rainy night of June 2, 1098, a small group of knights led by Bohemond scaled Pyrrhus' tower using rope ladders. They silently assassinated the Muslim guards and threw open the city's great gates. The Crusader army flooded Antioch in a frenzy, massacring the garrison and the Muslim inhabitants in an explosion of violence accumulated from months of suffering. However, the celebration lasted less than 24 hours. The next day, a gigantic and fresh Muslim relief army, coming from Mosul under the command of General Kerboga, arrived at Antioch. The roles had been dramatically reversed. The Crusaders, now locked inside a city completely devoid of food and exhausted, became the besieged. Kerboga's army surrounded Antioch on all sides. The situation seemed absolutely hopeless, and the Europeans prepared to starve to death or be slaughtered. It is at this moment of absolute despair that a mystical event occurred that changed the psychology of the army. A low-born French peasant monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had repeated visions of Saint Andrew. The saint allegedly revealed to him the exact location where the most sacred relic in Christendom was buried, the Holy Lance, the very weapon used by the Roman centurion Longinus to pierce the side of Jesus Christ during the crucifixion. Under the skeptical gaze of church leaders, but before a crowd of desperate soldiers, Peter Bartholomew began to dig the dirt floor beneath the altar of the Cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch. After hours of fruitless excavation, the monk himself leaped into the pit and, miraculously, pulled out a piece of ancient, rusted iron. Modern historians debate whether the lance was deliberately planted by the monk to save the army or if it was a genuine archaeological find from the Roman era, but the psychological impact of that discovery was overwhelming. The announcement that God had sent his lance to lead the Christians swept away despair and incited an unbelievable fervor of fanaticism in the soldiers. Men who could barely stand due to hunger suddenly felt invincible. On June 28, 1098, the gates of Antioch opened and the Crusader army marched out in battle formation, led by clergymen carrying the Holy Lance atop a pole. The Muslim general Kerboga, believing that the starving Christians would be easy prey, committed a critical mistake. He made the strategic error of not attacking them immediately upon exiting the gates, allowing the Crusaders to form their lines. Seized by an overwhelming mystical fury and advancing in a coordinated charge of infantry and cavalry, the Crusaders broke through the Muslim lines. Internal divisions among the emirs who composed Kerboga's army took their toll. Seeing the fury of the Christian attack, several Muslim leaders abandoned the battlefield with their troops. Kerboga's army collapsed in widespread panic and retreated. Against all odds of military logic, the Crusaders had defeated the greatest military power in the Middle East. The road to Jerusalem was open. The conquest and the bloodbath in the Holy City. After spending the remainder of the year 1098 in Antioch to recover and debate over who would rule the conquered city, an intense political dispute that ended with Bohemond of Taranto breaking the oath made to the Byzantine emperor and declaring himself Prince of Antioch, the Crusaders resumed their march southward in early 1099. They advanced along the coast of modern-day Palestine and Lebanon, capturing smaller cities and accepting bribes and tributes from local Muslim emirs who preferred to pay off the invaders rather than see their cities besieged and destroyed. Finally, on the morning of June 7, 1099, the vanguard of the Crusader army ascended the crest of a hill north of Jerusalem and spotted, gleaming under the desert sun, the imposing stone walls and domes of the Holy City. Many soldiers fell to their knees on the ground, weeping profusely, kissing the earth, and removing their footwear because they considered that ground holy. Years of suffering, hunger, loss of friends, and terrible ordeals had been worth it. They were standing before the ultimate goal of their lives. However, capturing Jerusalem would be a monumentally complex task. The city was under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, a Shia dynasty that had seized the city from the Seljuk Turks months earlier. The Muslim governor of Jerusalem, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, was an experienced and militarily impeccable commander. As soon as he heard of the Europeans' approach, he adopted a scorched earth tactic. He ordered the poisoning of all drinking water wells around the city, commanded the crops to be burned, and expelled all local Christian inhabitants from within Jerusalem to prevent them from spying or opening the gates for the Crusaders. Furthermore, the Muslim and Jewish garrison that remained inside the walls was heavily armed and well supplied with provisions to withstand months of siege. The Crusader army that besieged Jerusalem was a shadow of the force that had left Europe 3 years earlier. Of the initial 100,000 men, only about 12,000 professional soldiers and 1,200 mounted knights remained. They set up camp under a suffocating summer heat. The lack of water turned the siege into a daily torture. The poisoned wells forced soldiers to march miles under the attack of Muslim guerrilla bands to fetch water from distant puddles and the Jordan River. Chroniclers report that the water brought back was so contaminated and filled with mud that soldiers sewed animal hides to filter it, and many died bloated and poisoned. Food was growing scarce rapidly, and news that a gigantic Fatimid relief army was marching from Egypt to crush the Crusaders triggered the highest alarm signal. The Christians needed to capture Jerusalem immediately, or they would be annihilated beneath its walls. The Crusaders' greatest technical problem was the total lack of timber in the arid surroundings of Jerusalem to build siege engines, such as catapults and assault towers. Salvation came from a fortunate coincidence: a fleet of Genoese and English merchant ships docked on the coast of Jaffa. The sailors dismantled their own vessels and transported the wooden planks on their backs for miles to Jerusalem. Parallel to this, the Crusaders discovered a forest of olive trees and medium-sized trees a few miles away in the region of Samaria. Military engineers worked day and night to build 2 gigantic mobile wooden assault towers, more than 3 stories high, covered with freshly slaughtered animal hides and soaked with water to prevent them from being set on fire by the flaming arrows and the fearsome Greek fire shot by the Muslim defenders. To boost the morale of the troops, which was collapsing under the heat and fear of the Egyptian army, the clergy organized a religious procession on July 8. Following the biblical example of the fall of Jericho, the knights and soldiers walked barefoot, carrying crosses and relics, making a complete circle around the walls of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the Muslim defenders watched from atop the towers, mocking the Christian rituals and profaning crosses before the eyes of the besiegers. The ritual purified the army and ignited an uncontrollable desire for combat. On the night of July 13, 1099, the general and final assault was launched. The 2 large assault towers were pushed slowly toward the walls under a torrential rain of arrows, colossal stones shot by catapults, and cauldrons of boiling oil. The southern tower, commanded by Raymond of Toulouse, faced fierce resistance and was paralyzed by the Muslim defenses. However, the northern tower, masterfully commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon, was pushed silently during the night and repositioned at a weaker sector of the wall. At noon on July 15, 1099, Godfrey's tower finally touched the stone of the upper wall. Wooden drawbridges were lowered from within the tower and fell onto the parapet. two Flemish knight brothers, Lethold and Engelbert, were the first Western human beings to step onto the walls of Jerusalem, followed immediately by Godfrey of Bouillon and his men-at-arms. They overwhelmed the defenders of the tower and cleared space for hundreds of other knights to climb up using rope ladders. Within minutes, the gates of Jerusalem were opened from the inside and the mass of the Crusader army flooded the holy city. What followed in the hours after the fall of Jerusalem entered Western and Eastern history as one of the most brutal, bloody, and tragic episodes of the entire medieval period. Seized by an uncontrollable frenzy of religious fanaticism and vengeance accumulated over years of suffering and humiliation, the Crusaders began a widespread and systematic massacre of the entire population within the walls. Practically no Muslim or Jewish inhabitant was spared. The forces led by the Knight Tancred of Hauteville invaded the area of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, where thousands of Muslim civilians had sought refuge, believing that the sacred character of the site would be respected. Tancred went so far as to promise them protection in exchange for a substantial ransom, giving them his military banners to display on the roof as a sign of immunity, but the next day other groups of crusaders ignored the agreement, burst into the sacred temples, and beheaded and lynched all the refugees. The Jewish population of Jerusalem sought shelter in their main synagogue. The Crusaders surrounded the stone building, locked the doors from the outside, piled wood, and set the place on fire, burning alive hundreds of Jewish men, women, and children while singing religious hymns around the flames. The Christian chronicler Raymond of Aguilers, who walked the streets of Jerusalem shortly after the end of the fighting, wrote a famous and haunting phrase that sums up the scale of the barbarism: "If I tell the truth, I will barely be believed." Suffice it to say that in the streets and squares of Jerusalem, men rode with blood covering their knees and reaching up to the horses' reins. It was a just and wonderful judgment of God that this place, which suffered so much for its blasphemies, should be filled with the blood of the infidels. After the slaughter ended, when the streets were silent and covered with mountains of mutilated corpses, the Crusader leaders, washing the blood from their hands and faces and stripping off their armor, walked barefoot and in silent procession to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There, they fell to their knees before the empty tomb of Christ, weeping copiously with emotion and fervently thanking God for the victory of their holy mission. The objective of the Crusades had been achieved, but at the cost of a bloodbath whose psychological scars and geopolitical hatred would mark relations between the West and the East for centuries. The consolidation, the birth of the Crusader states. With the capture of Jerusalem, the Crusader movement faced an unprecedented political question: how to manage and govern conquered territories thousands of kilometers away from Europe, surrounded by hostile Islamic powers on all sides. The majority of the mass of common pilgrims and minor knights considered their promise to the Pope fulfilled and immediately began the journey back to their homes in Europe, leaving a contingent of only a few hundred knights to defend the new borders. To ensure the survival and defense of the Holy Land, the nobles who decided to remain resolved to replicate the model of political organization they knew perfectly: European feudalism. They created four large political entities known historically as the Crusader States, or d'outre-mer, the French term for overseas. The most important and central era was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, whose government was initially offered to Godfrey of Bouillon. Demonstrating a profound humility imbued with religiosity, Godfrey refused the title of king, stating that he would never wear a crown of gold in the city where Jesus Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he accepted the title of Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, protector of the Holy Sepulchre. When Godfrey died of illness the following year, in 1100, his more ambitious brother, Baldwin of Boulogne, did not have the same religious scruples and was officially crowned as Baldwin I, the first king of Jerusalem. The other three Crusader states were the County of Edessa in the far north, the first to be founded and the most geographically vulnerable, the Principality of Antioch, ruled by the Norman dynasty of Bohemond, and the County of Tripoli, in modern-day Lebanon. Each of these territories was fragmented into small fiefs granted to vassal knights, who built imposing stone castles on the hills to watch the routes and protect the borders against Muslim incursions. To solve the severe problem of the chronic lack of professional soldiers to garrison these isolated fortresses, entirely innovative and fascinating military and religious institutions emerged in the Holy Land, the military orders of monk knights. The members of these orders took traditional monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience to the church, but instead of spending their lives praying and copying manuscripts in isolated monasteries, they took up arms and dedicated their lives to fighting the enemies of the Christian faith. The most famous and legendary of these orders was the Knights Templar, officially the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, founded by Hugues de Payens in 1119. They established their headquarters directly in the complex of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Crusaders mistakenly believed this site to be the exact location of the ancient Temple of Solomon. Wearing their iconic white robes with a large red cross on the chest, the Templars quickly transformed into the most feared, disciplined, and efficient elite shock troops of the entire Middle Ages. They also functioned as an international financial powerhouse, creating the world's first transcontinental banking system to protect the money of European pilgrims. The other great order was the Knights Hospitaller, Order of St. John of Jerusalem. This order was originally born to run a hospital dedicated to the medical care and sheltering of poor and sick Christian pilgrims arriving in Jerusalem. However, faced with the pressing military needs of the kingdom, the Hospitallers also transformed into a formidable elite military force, wearing black robes with a white cross. Together, these military orders became the backbone of support for the Crusader states in the Levant, ensuring that the Western presence in the heart of the Middle East resisted for the coming decades. But the Islamic world, past the initial shock of the invasion, was beginning to reorganize for the reconquest.